Elijah Carter rode slow across the western plain because there was no reason to ride fast anymore. Once he had raced the son home to a small cabin where his wife waited on the porch, her dress catching the evening light. That life had ended with sickness and shallow breathing, with a grave dug into hard ground and a silence that never truly left. Since then, hurry had drained out of his bones. The land did not ask him to rush, and neither did his heart. Lucy, his old gray horse, stopped without being told. Her ears tipped forward, her body stiffened, and Elijah felt a warning travel up through the reins. The air had turned heavy and still. Beneath the usual smells of horse and dry earth crept another scent, sharp and bitter, burned wood. Elijah slid down from the saddle and stepped forward. When he cleared a low rise of brush, the ground opened into ruin. A wagon lay broken wide in the open, one wheel torn clean away, the others bent at wrong angles. The canvas cover hung in long ripped strips, snapping softly in the breeze. Trunks and boxes lay split open, their contents scattered across the dirt like the remains of a life spilled out too fast. Bodies lay around the wagon, men, women, and one small shape that made Elijah turn his face away. Limbs were twisted, hats knocked loose, eyes staring or mercifully turned from the sky. Elijah did not count them. Numbers would not change the truth written here. The deep quiet told him enough. Whoever had done this had ridden in with hate and ridden out without mercy. He moved among them slowly, careful with his steps. A scrap of ribbon lay clenched in a small hand. A hat sat upside down, its crown torn by a bullet. The air still held smoke, gunpowder, and the heavy iron smell of blood. Elijah knelt, not to pray, but to listen. Listening was one thing that still made sense to him. For a moment, there was nothing. Just wind moving through grass and the faint creak of broken wood. Then he heard it, a thin, uneven pull of air. Breath. The sound came from behind a blackened wagon wheel, half wrapped in a fur-lined cloak. A woman lay curled on her side. Ash streaked her face. Dried blood darkened one corner of her mouth. Her dark hair lay tangled in dust. One bare hand reached out toward nothing, fingers twitching just enough to prove life still held on. Elijah leaned close and held his palm near her mouth. A faint warmth brushed his skin. She was no child from a church wagon, but a grown woman close to his own age. What remained of her clothes had once been fine, lace still visible at the collar. A glove covered her right hand, its small buttons dulled with dust. Her bare left hand was scraped and swollen, marked like someone who had fought until strength ran out. He did not ask who she was. The dead around them carried that story and could not tell it. Elijah slid his arms under her and lifted. She felt too light, like grief had already taken most of her weight. Her head rested against his chest, her breath brushing his shirt in small, uneven bursts. He carried her back to Lucy, mounted carefully, and turned west. The sun was dropping low, laying red streaks across the land. Elijah did not look back at the wrecked wagon. He had done all he could there. His cabin sat 5 miles away, tucked into a small dip near a line of cottonwood trees. He had built it 3 years earlier, after sickness took his wife and left his days hollow. He had driven nails into wood just to keep his hands moving. The place held a stove, a narrow bed, a rough table, one chair, and a kind of quiet that rang in a man's ears. He carried the woman inside and laid her on the bed. Her breathing stayed thin but steady. Elijah filled a basin with water, tore an old shirt into strips, and washed soot and blood from her face and hands. He cleaned the cut at her mouth, wrapped her scraped fingers in cloth soaked with oil, and saw dark bruises already rising along her ribs and shoulder. Night settled over the hills. Crickets sang outside. An owl called once from the cottonwoods. Inside, the stove glowed low and soft, pushing the dark back just enough. Elijah dragged his chair beside the bed and sat down. He folded his arms across his chest and watched her breathe. He did not sleep. Her breathing became the only clock that mattered. Gray light finally crept through the small window. Cold air slipped under the door. Elijah's neck ached, but he did not move until he saw her fingers twitch beneath the blanket. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling as if unsure which world she had returned to. Her gaze drifted across the stove, the table, the single chair, a small sketch of a smiling woman on the shelf. Finally, her eyes found him. She tried to sit up. Pain caught her ribs, and a sharp breath tore from her chest. "Easy," Elijah said quietly. "You're safe. This is my place." Her lips moved without sound. Elijah poured water into a tin cup and held it until her shaking hands closed around it. She drank slowly, then rested the cup in her lap and watched him, waiting. "Do you remember your name?" he asked. Her eyes dropped to the glove still covering her right hand. Her jaw tightened. "I do not know," she said. Elijah heard the lie in the small hitch of her breath. He saw it in the way her fingers gripped the blanket. He did not push. Names carried stories, and some stories were too heavy to lift all at once. "Then we'll wait," he said. "No hurry here." For 2 days, the cabin stayed quiet. She slept in long stretches and woke only for broth and bread. Once, tears slid into her hair as she stared at the ceiling. Elijah did not ask what she saw. On the third morning, he stepped in from feeding the animals and felt his chest jump when he saw the bed empty. Then he noticed the door standing open. She stood on the small porch, wrapped in one of his coats, bare feet on worn boards. Early light washed across the prairie, turning wet grass to silver. "You'll catch cold," Elijah said. She answered that she had to see the sky to know the world kept turning. They stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the wide land. She looked up at him then, truly seeing him. In her eyes, he saw a deep hurt and a stubborn spark that refused to die. "I should not be alive," she said. "Maybe," Elijah answered, "but you are." She said she did not know who she was now. Elijah told her there was no rush to decide. Days passed. She grew stronger in small steps. She sat at the table. She walked from stove to door. Elijah stayed close without crowding her. One evening, she peeled potatoes while he split wood. Her knife slipped and cut her finger. He set a clean rag beside her hand and stepped back. "Hands remember by working," he said. The cabin slowly changed. Bread baked uneven but warm. Silence softened. One night, he returned from town with an old upright piano. She stared at it like a ghost had walked in. That night, she touched the keys, and something inside her eased. Music filled the cabin, thin at first, then stronger. Elijah listened from his chair, letting the sound settle into the walls. Later, by firelight, he asked if there was a name she wanted him to use, not the one tied to fear, but the one that still felt true. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she lifted her head. "Once," she said softly, "the people who knew me called me Evelyn." Elijah nodded. "Then that's who you are here." Hope, thin but steady, pulled tight in her chest. The past still hurt, but for the first time since the wagon road, the future did not feel empty, and somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the wide land waited to see what would grow next. Life settled into a slow, careful rhythm after that. Morning light crept across the floorboards, and by the time the first band of sun touched the stove, Elijah was already outside. He fed the animals, checked the fence, and spoke low to Lucy while the air still held the chill of night. Inside, Evelyn woke later, listening to the sounds of his boots and the scrape of tin. Those sounds told her where she was before fear could take hold. At first, she stayed in bed most of the day. Her ribs ached, and her hands throbbed when she tried to grip anything. Elijah did not hover. He told her when to drink and when to eat, then let the quiet do its work. When she slept, he split wood or fixed small things around the cabin. When she woke, he was there. Without asking questions, she was not ready to answer. On the third morning after she gave him her name, Evelyn decided she would not lie flat anymore. The room tipped when she stood, but it steadied again. Elijah pulled the chair out from the table and told her she could sit if she was ready. She eased down, jaw tight, refusing to let the pain show more than it had to. They faced each other across the rough table. Elijah poured thin coffee, cut with hot water, into a tin cup and slid it toward her. Steam rose between them. She wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth soak into her fingers. The first sip tasted bitter, but clean. It tasted like something meant for the living. They ate in a quiet that did not pinch. When he asked about the pain, she said it was dull now, instead of sharp. Elijah nodded and said that was enough for the day. As the week passed, Evelyn pushed herself farther. Short walks from bed to door, door to stove, stove back to chair. Elijah stayed close enough to catch her if she fell, but far enough to let her stand on her own. By the end of the week, she could carry water from the pump, stopping once to rest her breath. One afternoon, she peeled potatoes while he split wood outside. Her fingers were still clumsy, and the knife slipped, cutting her skin. Elijah stepped in, set a clean rag beside her, and left the knife where it lay. "Hands remember by working," he said. She pressed the rag to the cut and picked the knife back up. The cabin changed in small ways. One evening, Elijah came in from the barn and stopped short. The air smelled like warm yeast and brown crust, a smell he had not known since his wife was alive. On the table sat a loaf of bread, uneven and dark at the edges. Evelyn stood by the stove, flour on her wrists, waiting. He tore off a piece and took a slow bite. The crust cracked under his teeth. The inside was heavy but good. "It tastes right," he said. The tight line around her mouth eased. That night, they ate rabbit stew and fresh bread. The cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. The next week, Elijah rode into town for supplies. When he returned, a borrowed cart rattled behind Lucy. On it sat an old upright piano, scarred and dull, keys yellow at the edges. Evelyn stepped onto the porch and froze. She stared as if she were seeing something pulled straight from a dream. The storekeeper had no use for it, Elijah said. He had been glad to trade it off. Together they wrestled it into the cabin and set it against the far wall. The room felt smaller, but also fuller, like a missing piece had rolled back into place. That first night, Evelyn only dusted the lid and rested her hand there. The second night, as the sun dropped low, Elijah was halfway to the barn when he heard the sound. Thin, careful notes drifted through the open door. He stopped and listened. The tune was simple and slow, like someone testing ice before stepping out. It carried more feeling than any word she had spoken. When he stepped inside, she finished the line and let the last note fade. Her shoulders dropped, and something tight left her face. She said music felt like breath to her, and without it she felt half alive. Elijah told her it sounded like her heart had finally found a way to speak. Later that night, by low firelight, he asked if she wanted him to use her name more often. Not the one tied to fear, but the one that felt true. She said Evelyn again, this time without flinching. Strength returned in pieces. She swept the floor. She washed clothes at the pump. She hung simple fabric over the window to soften the light. Empty jars filled with wildflowers appeared on the table. The cabin grew warmer, not from the stove, but from being shared. Most evenings ended with her at the piano. At first the notes stumbled. Then they grew steadier. Elijah sat by the stove. Boots crossed and let the music settle into his tired bones. He never clapped. He only nodded and said the place sounded less empty now. One afternoon, Evelyn found a thin book tucked behind the hearthstones. Its pages were worn, filled with lines in a language Elijah did not know. That night, she read aloud by the fire, not for him to understand the words, but for the sound of them. The language flowed smooth and low. He told her he did not need to know the meaning to feel that it mattered. A storm rolled in without warning a few days later. The sky darkened and thunder rolled over the prairie. When lightning cracked close, Evelyn's shoulders jumped hard. Elijah said nothing. He laid a thick wool shawl around her shoulders and tucked it close. She clutched it and breathed through the fear. She said storms once came off the sea where she had lived before. Elijah said he had never seen the sea, only rivers that ran too fast and did not care who tried to cross. The storm passed. Days returned to their steady pace. One evening, Evelyn set her remaining glove on the table and left it there. Elijah noticed. He said nothing, but something inside him loosened. On a clear night, they walked to the ridge beyond the barn. The land rolled wide and open, the sky painted in soft orange and rose. Evelyn said the space scared her, like it could swallow her whole. Elijah told her the land did not ask to be conquered, only lived alongside. She listened, and the fear eased a little. Near the door that night, she asked why he had bought the piano instead of more flour or nails. Elijah told her that on the first day, when she lay half-conscious on his bed, her fingers had moved like they were pressing keys only she could see. He said he wanted to give that back to her. Her throat tightened. When she played that night, the tune was softer than before, full of pauses, like a prayer spoken without words. Time moved on. One cool morning, Evelyn said she wanted to ride into town alone. She said she needed to know if she could stand somewhere beyond the cabin. Elijah checked Lucy's saddle twice and told her to leave if anything felt wrong. The town was quiet when she arrived. For a few minutes, no one paid her any mind. That felt like a gift. She chose flour and thread, her shoulders easing. Then a man recognized her. He spoke her old family name, his voice sharp with surprise. The word hit her like cold wind. He said her uncle had sent letters across the country. He said she had been promised to a man of standing. Evelyn told him she was no one to him anymore. She paid quickly and left, her heart pounding all the way home. Elijah knew something was wrong the moment she rode into the yard. He waited until they were inside. Then she told him everything. The money, the title, the escape, the wagon meant to hide her. She asked if he was angry. He said hiding was not the same as lying. He said everyone had the right to guard the parts of themselves that had been used and hurt. Relief broke through her like rain. That night, she asked if she could sleep near him, not touching, just close enough to feel safe. Elijah moved over on the narrow bed. They lay there, listening to the wind. For the first time since the massacre, Evelyn slept through the night. By morning, something new had settled between them, not named, not rushed, but real enough to protect. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the past had not finished reaching for her yet. The year that followed did not feel like a legend. It felt like work, honest, steady work that began with the sun and ended when the light faded from the land. Evelyn and Elijah rose each morning to the same wide sky. She went to the pump with sleeves rolled and cold water biting her fingers. He came from the barn with hay on his shirt and a quiet smile she waited for, without admitting it to herself. They moved around each other with ease, like people who had shared a roof for years. She cooked with growing confidence, cracking eggs, turning cornbread, stirring stew, until it thickened just right. He fixed fences, mended hinges, and built small things that made life smoother. The cabin, once only his, now held both of them in every corner. Evenings were their own. Sometimes she played the piano until stars filled the sky. Sometimes they sat on the porch in silence, listening to wind move through grass. The land no longer felt like it was watching her. It felt like it was holding her. One bright morning, dust rose on the eastern line of the prairie. Elijah saw it first. A lone rider came hard toward the cabin. Horse pushed too fast for comfort. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. The past had learned their address. They met the rider near the yard. He wore finer clothes than most men out here. He spoke politely, but his eyes went straight to Evelyn. He said he had come on family business. He spoke of a missing woman born to money and title. He said her uncle wanted her brought home. Evelyn stood beside Elijah, not behind him. Her hands trembled once, then steadied. She said the woman he spoke of no longer lived. That name had been a chain, and she had laid it down. Here, she was only Evelyn. The man said she owed her family more than a cabin and a widower. Elijah answered that she owed them nothing they had not already taken. She had chosen this life. Anyone who came to drag her away would have to walk through him first. The rider looked at the fence line, the barn, the piano through the open door, and the way Evelyn stood like the ground itself held her steady. He backed down. He said others might come. Then he rode east, dust fading behind him. When he was gone, Evelyn's knees weakened. Elijah offered his hand. She took it. Together they walked to the cottonwood tree on the ridge. There she knelt and dug into the dirt. From her pocket she pulled a gold ring with a pale blue stone. the last fine thing from her old life. She buried it beneath the roots and smoothed the earth flat. She said the past could stay there. Days passed. No riders came. Evelyn stopped watching the horizon with fear. She watched it with calm eyes, ready if it ever tested her again. One soft evening under the cottonwood, Elijah spoke plain. He said he thought his life had ended the day he buried his first wife. He said he had been wrong. Evelyn laid her hand against his chest and said he had given her more than shelter. He had given her a place where she could breathe. They married there not long after. No crowd. No fine clothes, just vows spoken with work-worn hands and steady hearts. That night they sat on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, watching the last light fade. The prairie lay open around them, not as a threat, but as home. A widower and a runaway baroness were gone. What remained were two people who chose to stay.